Bread. Who does not know bread? In fact, who does not eat bread? Yeah, I know. I know a couple of people in the world, maybe due to medical reasons or probably due to personal choices of delicacies, may not really familiarize themselves with the eating of bread. But at least everyone in his or her own crevice might, one way or the other, have heard bread, probably through the market or in the various restaurants, or especially in most people's homes. Bread is very much appreciated. Let me take you through some very interesting facts about bread. Probably you know some of them. Like I said earlier, bread, I mean the bread we eat, is one of the oldest food preparation methods. Bread making is suggested to have originated more than 6,000 years ago, where people roasted grains and used them to bake. Secondly, it is recorded that bread at some points in time in the historical times was used as a form of currency and even as a form of credit. In fact, during the Middle Ages, bakers in France, for example, were powerful credit brokers. Yes, credit brokers, even loaning out bread. That's a fact, an interesting one at that. Thirdly, we know that is also an interesting detail that bread, as already said, was a vital part of Egyptian life and culture, used as even a currency. But interestingly, even though in modern times we wouldn't venture in using this particular fact, moldy bread, that is bread with mold, was used by ancient Egyptians to treat infections. Whoa, moldy bread. Or let me put it more bluntly, bread with some fungi and other parasites on it. Molds. It can be gray, it can be green. And you think about it that in the olden times, the Egyptians could use it to treat infections. And it showcases an early understanding of the antibiotic properties of certain molds. Well, even before Fleming. Again, bread, particularly the wholemeal, is an important source of dietary fiber, and that aids in digestion. One particular fact that really interests me is the fact that within 5 years of its invention, the sliced bread accounted for 80% of all bread sold in the US. So astonishing. Finally, are you aware that bread is very diverse? In our current world, there are more than 100 known varieties and still counting. You may be asking, why begin with the story of bread? Well, it is important for us to know what bread really signifies, especially as we continue our discourse in the historical analysis of the book of the Exodus. Especially at this time where, throughout the previous episodes, we have learned that Israel has left Egypt. Basically, in our discourse today, we will quickly discover very important information, pieces of information with regards to the role of bread, the role of water, and the power of murmuring and disunity. We know biblically that the people of Israel had crossed the border of Egypt. Remember, we discussed that they lived in Goshen, just a few miles from the border between the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt. And we clarified perfectly that Israel had to go through about 150 miles of walking, of course, in danger as they thought, to be able to reach the Gulf of Aqaba, where they crossed into where modern day we call Saudi Arabia. And friends, it's perfectly clear again that they had ventured into a land flowing with milk and honey. But before this, there were a lot of perplexities. For 3 days, as we have seen, everything seemed perfect. But as you know, every travel comes with some uncertainties. And it is understandable that as they journeyed through the desert, through the wilderness, for 3 days they would have started diminishing in terms of their supplies. The question is, how could they feed 2 million people in the desert? And as expected, at the signs of trouble, the people now resorted to complain, as we see in even our modern times. Unfortunately, they started making assertions like we would have loved to die in Egypt. And clearly, theologically, their faith had waned. In this regard, we are brought to a very pertinent junction where we need to clarify why these ensuing proceedings really happened. As we go through, we will look at, very importantly, clean water, how it is important in this context. Of course, in the narrative of Exodus, the bread of heaven was also discussed. Again, Horeb, which most people do not know is actually Sinai, is going to be clearly discussed. Not just Horeb, but the rock at Horeb. It is equally important to look at a very interesting warfare that happened during the sojourn of the Israelites, where effort of man met the miraculous reckoning and the display of power of God. Historically and scientifically, how it was possible and why it is relevant. Then we also analyze the importance of counseling, where humans are never supposed to forget the power of our older generation. And finally, we get back at bread and, of course, water. I am very much interested in what we really understand sanitized water to be in our modern day. Are you aware that modern day water that we drink go through a lot of chemical processes, sometimes even alien to the majority of people who drink it? In fact, if we were supposed to be exposed to the chemical processes, the biological processes, as well as the processing plants that sanitized, or more accurately, I could say, treated water go through, many would give up drinking. But it wasn't actually the first time water was sanitized. In the biblical narrative, the Israelites had reached where they call Marah. In fact, the word Marah actually stems from a Hebrew word which basically means bitter or unpleasant. So it is no surprise that the name was actually propounded during this sojourn. In the biblical narrative, we are told that they couldn't drink its water because it was bitter. And like I said, that is why it's called Marah. Unfortunately, the people started murmuring. And this seems to be the philosophy of the people of Israel. It appears consistently they keep murmuring, especially right after the miraculous display of God. It's no surprise that concurrently in our day now, most of us easily forget what we experience as miracles from God? Well, we always want to juxtapose with what we believe is scientifically insane or does not need to be accredited to God. Let's delve deeper. The water that was found to be unsafe was a point of contact for complaining. The Israelites asked, "What shall we drink?" In fact, it is very clear the same God who had provided the cloud during the day and the pillar of fire during the night could have cleansed the water before they even arrived. And you ask yourself, why would God wait for this particular moment? In another case study, you could also ask, why not do the miracle before the beneficiaries come to see? Well, if miracles do not happen in the sight of those who need to see, can it be called a miracle? You can only attest to something you see vividly. But patience was lacking. The problem is the Israelites had forgotten. So what happens is that Moses performs what he is directed to do. And this brings us to a very important biological process. The importance and the connection between water and trees. Are you aware that trees and water have a very important hydrological connections? I always say that our discourses are really connected to what we can prove scientifically. It is of no accidental miracle that God ordered Moses to pick a tree, which etymologically, the base word in Hebrew could also mean a stick, to put into the water to make it whole. Trees and water bodies are actually connected through the water cycle. Trees regulate water temperature, they filter pollutants, and even improve soil infiltration. These may be big words, but basically, trees, as we see, do have the power to regulate the temperature of water. Of course, when you have the canopies of trees covering the surfaces of water bodies, direct sunlight is inhibited and the waters can be cooled. Trees actually, through the process of their roots, filter pollutants in water. So it is no surprise that any particular world, and when I say world, I mean any particular place you find yourself, which does not respect the existence of trees in the context of afforestation, has problems with water bodies. In other words, you wouldn't want to see a clear water without the power of trees. In this case, God through Moses did not only scientifically show the significance and correlation between trees and water, but actually performed another record for Israel to remember. It didn't end there, and that brings us closely to what was begun in our discourse. When the Israelites saw this, they said to each other, "What is it?" And I asked myself the same question when I saw this particular quote. Friends, what is it became a name, and that is what we now know as manna. You know, in our previous episodes, you may remember that I said every name in the Bible has a very important origin. Are you aware that the Israelites craved for meat during their sojourn in the desert? Well, their cravings were not for naught. In fact, it led them to grumble against Moses and Aaron. But their grumbling was something that was perpetuated to God Himself. The question is, who was the problem? First of all, once again, the past was forgotten. And you ask yourself, who were the people who had been given a miraculously sanitized water a few days ago, the Israelites. It doesn't end there. They actually focused on the difficulties of the present and by consequence lost sight of the promised future. What happens in our world today? Many people enjoy the present and forget what promises this present can give us, even amidst problems. After giving them quail, which we see in our modern times, birds along the seacoast, God actually provided them with enough bread to feed them every day for 40 years. And you ask yourself, which bread is this? Do not forget that bread has a lot of scientific significance. It is no surprise that God didn't choose just any article of food, but bread. The fiber, the good digestion, and even its ability to be molded in several forms or treated in several recipes. Bread has a lot of connotations. How miraculous was this bread? When the sun rose, this particular bread melted. And so, Israelites really asked a very important question. What is it? Secondly, the same amount fell for 5 days, and this is important for you to understand the nature of this bread. On the sixth day, it fell twice as much. It happens that on the Sabbath, nothing fell. Finally, from one day to the next, it was filled with worms. But from Friday to Saturday, it was never spoiled. Lessons learned. Sheer obedience reaped results. In this case, if you had gone out to try and find the manna on the Sabbath, you would find none because provisions were made previously. Are you aware that even after the miraculous sanitization of the waters, Israel had quickly forgotten? The question is the Lord among us or not? Well, God sent the Israelites bread from heaven every day. They did see it in the cloud. But it is so astonishing, even in our current world, the display of natural elements. All the world through the songs of animals, through biological processes, through predictions in the Bible which are happening. People are still mesmerized by the fact that God is really the perpetrator of goodness and is still existent. It is of no surprise because Israelites of old really expressed the same lack of faith. And that is where we find the significance of Paul's reckoning or caution that we cannot fall in the same unbelief. It is important to note that Paul actually references what happens in Exodus. In 1 Corinthians, he mentions the rock which is Christ. And that having been said, with this depiction of the rock being Christ, the provision of water was directly from him. The question that we can ask is, how could the rock be Christ? Remember, in Exodus 17:6, Moses was instructed to strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. And he actually did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Christ, in his own reckoning, was struck in the sight of the elders of Israel. And you ask me, who were the elders then? It was the clergy, it was the priests, it was the ministers who stood in the full glare of the Calvary experience. And it is no coincidence that Moses is told or recorded to have done this in the sight of the elders. Christ also, being the rock, was struck, killed in the sight of the elders. In fact, the whole priesthood that were at the Calvary experience were representatives of the whole human nature and human entities. In other words, they were representatives and eyes of the cross, the same way as the elders were also representatives of the whole of Israel. Very importantly, Paul clarified that we all drank from the same spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It doesn't end there. The raised hands, and this is where I would like to quickly look into a very important group of people in the context of the Bible. Have you ever heard of the Amalekites? Who are they, and where do they come from? Well, the Amalekites were nomadic desert dwelling people, and basically being nomadic means trading with animals, roaming here and there to search for greener pastures. And they are descendants of Amalek. Does that name ring a bell? Well, Amalek was actually the grandson of Esau, the firstborn of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. They are known for their swift camel riding and guerrilla tactics. They controlled key trade zones in the Sinai and the Negev deserts. If you remember perfectly, when we were discussing where the Israelites traded from Goshen going into the Aqaba, the Gulf, we could very much spot where the Amalekites were on the map, as you can see. Historically, they were opportunistic predators, and that means they attacked weak and trailing stragglers rather than facing armies head on, according to Deuteronomy 25. But politically, they represented defiance against God's covenant purposes. You see, unlike Jericho's Rahab, who feared Israel's God, the Amalekites, unfortunately, brazenly tested him in battle. They actually decided to face Israel. Of course, in the same guerrilla tactics that they used. So here we are. As they advanced through the desert, these Amalekites attacked Israel, and Moses had to ask Joshua to defend them while he and Aaron and Hur, as we know, went up the mountain with the rod of God. Remember, the same rod which Moses had laid before Pharaoh. But the question that we ask is, why did these Amalekites attack? Well, as already said, they heard what God had done in Egypt. But in direct consonance with the prediction of how Esau would always be at the heels of Jacob, it is clear that this particular projection was still being realized even through the descendants of Esau. And you ask yourself, well, it was supposed to be Jacob really attaching his hands to the heels of his elder brother. But remember, the blessing given to Jacob, whose descendants are the Israelites now, had been a point of reference for Esau's descendants now to be in direct defiance to Jacob's, who are blessed of God. In other words, the descendants of Esau were now in direct contravention with the Israelites, and directly the Amalekites were descendants of Esau. Unlike other Canaanites, they were not afraid. And of course, it is so even in their father, Esau. Never afraid to go through the areas of the forest to bring in meat. Raiding here and there. Remember, that was the same attitude of their grandfather Esau. Moving through various wilderness and always bringing in game or the spoils wherever he found them. They mocked God, and to better defeat them at Rephidim, God asked Moses to raise God's rod. Remember, at this time, the emphasis is not Moses' rod, but God's rod. And when his arm grew very weak, then the fight was turning to a defeat for the Israelites. This particular happening presents to us that whenever miracles are bound to happen, it is not only limited to the miraculous display of God, but also ultimately and equally importantly, the effort and readiness of his people. Convert that to what happens in our world today. It requires effort in order to face our problems and challenges head on. But the final battle has always been for the Lord. The raised hands need to stay raised. The efforts need to stay going. Our plans need to be laid out. The prayers need to be given. The knees need to be bent, that the final and ultimate victory can be given. Do you have bread in your house? Now you know how powerful and the historical facts behind it. It happens that Moses' in-law, Jethro, visited him and realized that Moses was struggling. You see, at times we tend to handle issues our own way. It appears we feel without what we do, it can never happen. But in this particular narrative, the counsel and significance of delegation is brought to bear. What Jethro tells Moses to do is actually significant for the world today. He wasn't an Israelite, but did worship God. And he presents to us the principle of delegation. After receiving Moses' report and what had happened in Egypt, indeed, he praised God himself. But when he witnessed what Moses was doing as a judge, he gave him a very important counsel to share out his responsibilities. It is very easy to assume that you are okay doing it alone. It is very easy to assume that you are the best for a particular assignment. But the wealthiest of advices has to do with how you delegate in an equal measure. Indeed, Moses did acknowledge this advice. And what happened is mouth-watering. He heeded his father-in-law's advice and chose people capable of carrying the responsibilities. The characteristics here are very much clearly stated. That these people had to be respectful of God, they had to be trustworthy, and hate bribery. These three, somewhat in some ways, and especially in this corporate world of ours, are very much the foundational tenets whenever appointing people in the trust of positions. Do they respect God, authority? Are they trustworthy? Are they corrupt? Do they accept bribe? And it is a reference of good governance even for our day today.